Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the webinar, Understanding the COVID-19 Crisis, Critical Reflections on the Contributions of the Sociology of Law. This webinar is held in collaboration with the Research Committee for Sociology of Law of the International Sociology Association and the Working Group on Political Sociology and Socio-Legal Studies of the Latin American Sociological Association. My name is Wilson Hernández. I am researcher at GRADE. I'm here in a good company with colleagues and great academics. Sheila, Fernández, and Cesar Bazan are organizing this webinar, and I will be moderating this session, the second session called Domestic Violence, Violence Against Women, and Gender Violence. We have a wonderful panel combining disciplines, perspectives to address these types of violence around the world. I'm going to say to everyone in the as viewers of this webinar that there are several ways of participating. You can raise your little hand in this Zoom platform. You can also put your questions in the question and answer site, or you can find any other way to transmit your questions. That we will select at the end of the presentations. We will select some questions, and we can even, as it was yesterday, we can open your camera, or you can open your camera and your mic to directly propose a question. Well, a couple of days ago, the World Bank has published a list of more than 100 measures taken by more than 50 countries around the world. And I just would like to raise awareness on 3 issues before our speakers start. One, communication campaigns are one of the most favorite common measures taken by governments against this pandemic in the shadow, as has been called the issue of gender violence during these difficult months. However, stopping aggressors or motivating victims to report IPV, intimate partner victims, need more than a marketing approach and need more than just saying it's your right to report. Second, not all victims are equal, not all aggressors are equal. There are victims typology and batterer typology. They are heterogeneous and react differently to policy measures, to communication campaigns, and also act differently during lockdowns. And finally, evidence is useful but not sufficient. We are facing difficult times with minor previous orientations on how to prevent violence. So what do we do? How do we analyze these problems to solve? Or which are our critical perspectives to analyze this issue? Our 3 speakers are going to give 3 presentations, 3 15-minute presentations in order to try to tackle the general aspects of gender-based violence and the subjects around it. We have Kerry Carrington, who will be meeting through a video because she's now in a place where there's a difficult internet connections. I'm going to read all the bios right now, and then I'm going to start with the presentations. Professor Kerry Carrington is the head of School of Justice, Faculty of Law, Queensland University of Technology, Australia. She actively participates in several top journals. In 2014, she received a Lifetime Award Achievement from the American Society of Criminology. In 2018, she co-edited the Palgrave Handbook in Criminology and the Global South, a landmark 50-chapter volume described by Rewin Connell as revolutionary. I agree. Then we will have Leigh Goodmark of University of Maryland, Baltimore. She has a presentation that is entitled The U.S. Response to Intimate Partner Violence in the Age of COVID-19. Leigh is Professor of Law and Co-Director, Clinical Law Program in the University of Maryland. She graduated from Stanford Law School and previously was the Director of the Clinical Education and Family Law Clinic and co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she had been a faculty member since 2003. And finally, we will have Lars Alberth from LeuphanaUniversity Lüneburg. Lars is a professor of theories and methods of childhood studies at LeuphanaUniversity, Lüneburg, Germany. He's a research affiliate of the Crimes Against Children, a research center at the University of New Hampshire. He was a board member of the ISRC 53 Sociology of Childhood and is currently speaker of the section Sociology of Childhood in the German Sociological Association. Well, we are now going to start with the presentation of Kerry, and you can ask your questions at the end of all the presentations. Don't feel shy, please, and try to be actively participating. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Kerry Carrington. I'm a professor at the QUT Centre for Justice in Australia. That's not Brisbane behind me. It's just a video of some lovely ocean, which I'd love to visit one day. I'm making this recording of my presentation for the webinar on the impact of COVID crisis because I'm unsure whether I will have access to the internet, because I in fact will be going to the beach and will be there during the time of the webinar. My particular address is about the impact of COVID on domestic violence, violence against women and gender violence, but also its policing. Thanks for listening. At the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said that this pandemic is not only challenging both global health systems, but our commitment to equality and human dignity. He went on to caution that while quarantines and other restrictions were absolutely essential to combat the pandemic, the measures also increased the risk of violence towards women trapped with abusive partners. It was almost like locking women up with their abusive partners. Now, the United Nations also gave some advice to its member countries that any national response prioritise support for women, that they integrate prevention efforts and services to respond to violence against women into COVID-19 plans, that they designate domestic violence shelters as essential services, that they increase resources to them, as well as increasing resources to all the other agencies in the domestic violence sector. They called for the expansion of the capacities to house victims of violence by doing things like repurposing empty hotels to accommodate the quarantine needs, and to designate safe spaces for women where they could report abuse without alerting their perpetrators, such as in pharmacies, doctors, grocery stores, etc. They also, of course, warned that there could be issues around technology and technology abuse and control, so moving services to online should contemplate that possibility as well. Now, we already know from the literature on domestic and family violence that it does increase during times of crisis and disasters such as fires and floods and cyclones and extreme weather events, which are happening more frequently due to climate change. But this is the first time that a health pandemic has really impacted on the rates and prevalence and problems of addressing domestic family violence. Now, the number of homicide due to domestic violence have allegedly, I say allegedly because we don't know exactly how accurate these figures are, have apparently more than doubled in places like China, United Kingdom, and they're certainly been higher than normal in Australia as well. Well, at the very beginning of the pandemic in early April, there were early indications that the rates of domestic and family violence against women were rising, and that women were also isolated and less able to access support. Australian healthcare professionals predicted an impending increase, and the United Nations called it a shadow pandemic. The sector reported high levels of domestic violence, and including one Victorian study of a 50% increase in client numbers, a 50% increase in violence associated with COVID, and a 47% increase in violence reported for the very first time. So the very early indications were that the COVID pandemic was having quite a serious impact on the incidence and the rate. But also, apparently, the new forms of violence against women emerging during the pandemic, such as the threat to infect partners with the virus, or using the virus as a way to extend coercive control over their partners or ex-partners. So during the pandemic, domestic family violence services found that the complexity of their clients' needs increased very considerably because they couldn't report easily. They were having problems reporting without being surveilled in their own home, and such measures. Well, isolation is already a tactic or a strategy used by domestic violence abusers, but this has been elevated in during the COVID-19 restrictions. It's also an issue for LGBTIQ survivors who experience similar levels of violence to heterosexual or cisgender women. There's also growing concern amongst the LGBTIQ communities about the impact of isolation and lockdowns on rates of domestic violence, families and same-sex couples. Domestic violence workers also reported that isolation heightens the vulnerability of immigrant and refugee women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds as well. So quite a few marginalised groups there, more adversely impacted by COVID. The advocates have also reported increased complexities and challenges in assisting victims amidst the COVID pandemic, and that abusers have been using social distancing, isolation and quarantine process to extend women's conditions of what they call unfreedom. Additionally, accounts have emerged of abuse providing false information about the pandemic and about their own health status in order to confine women to the home, and of locking women out of their residences in efforts to even expose them to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, technologically assisted domestic violence, it has become increasingly more common, and affords opportunities to harass, coerce and surveil partners within abusive relationships. But technology can also be used to provide those who are stuck in domestic violence relationships opportunities to seek help, and to also seek safety. But certainly during the early period of the pandemic, the New South Wales Attorney General, Mark Spearman, reported that there had been a 75% increase in searches on domestic violence, and there'd also been an increase of men telephoning and seeking help to deal with their own anger and their own propensities to commit violence against their partners as well. However, the whole COVID situation has assisted the abusers' use of technology to control and monitor women and their presence in the home, making it very difficult for women to access or use IT devices to seek support or safety because they're under a situation of constant isolation and surveillance. Well, you might say, what should be done about domestic and family violence? Now, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, the feminist movement would have been very proud to say that we made domestic violence a public matter and not a private matter. We called upon the state to protect women as victims of violence. But the problem with that is that the parts of the state that were called upon to protect women were mostly always men, and they were in uniform from the police. So the criminal justice system and the criminal justice response to domestic family violence has been the one that was commonly adopted across the kind of certainly the Anglo-centric world. But as we can clearly see, more police is not the answer. The Black Lives Matter campaign after the killing of George Floyd has called to defund the police. Now, this is gaining a great deal of momentum and support from academics, policymakers, and of course activists and campaigners. The problem is there's some in the domestic violence sector are saying, well, excuse me, who's going to help victims of domestic and family violence if it's not the police? Now, the answer to that is the police have never been much of a help to the victims of domestic and family violence, and that this has often been used to justify the police oppression of marginalised and black communities. Now, in Australia, Indigenous women are 32 times more likely to be a victim of domestic family violence, and they're something like 6 times more likely to be killed by a partner than non-Indigenous women. But if they seek support from the police for a domestic family violence matter, they are at a very high risk of having their children removed from their care and their partner jailed, or even themselves jailed. Now, in Australia, there's a really tragic case of Ms. Dhu, DHU, who in 2014 police were called to her premises by a neighbourhood call to say that there was domestic violence happening in this particular house. The police called, and they discovered when they arrived that Ms. Dhu, the victim of the domestic violence, had an outstanding order for a fine. So they decided to treat the matter as a criminal justice matter, and they locked her up in police custody for outstanding fines. They also took her partner and locked him up as well. Now, she died 2 days later after seeking help, after crying for help. She died of injuries that she sustained from broken ribs during that domestic violence incident, which went septic, and the police failed to adequately provide care for her. Now, the coroner described her care as absolutely heartless, cruel and degrading, but this is not, unfortunately, uncommon in Australia. In Queensland, the 63% of women who are in jail for breaches of domestic violence family orders are Indigenous women. These orders are being used as a social control mechanism against black and marginalised communities, and including the very women that they allege they are supposedly set up to support. Now, Leigh Goodmark, who will be speaking soon, has long emphasised that criminal justice responses to domestic family violence are themselves dysfunctional and repeatedly fail women. And she's also pointed out that the use of the criminal justice system to respond to intimate partner violence coincided with the rise of mass incarceration, and of course mass incarceration has had a catastrophic impact both in Australia and in the United States and elsewhere on Indigenous peoples in Australia and black people in the United States. Well, I've been doing a study of women's police stations, which are a novel invention from the global south. They were first established in Brazil in 1985 and Argentina in 1988 as a unique way of responding to domestic family and sexual violence. They don't prioritise a criminal justice response over women's wishes. They operate in very different ways to traditional policing models. They operate from a gender perspective, and they prevent gender family violence in three ways: by working with victims and offenders, sending offenders off to learn or unlearn their violent ways, to work with their local organisations so they share resources on in terms of responding to particular cases. But more importantly, they take a much more sociological, preventative approach and educative approach to trying to turn around the norms within their communities. So as part of that study, we actually sought the opinions of those who in Australia who had sought police assistance for a domestic violence matter, how satisfied they were with the traditional policing response. 60% were dissatisfied, and of those, 40% were extremely dissatisfied. And when we asked them for the reasons why, basically most of them said that the police did nothing to help, or that the police blamed and judged them or didn't take them seriously. Same-sex victims can particularly complain about being taken seriously, as did some male victims, but they had no understanding whatsoever of the gender dynamics, and may have even sided with the perpetrator. And Indigenous women feared seeking help from the police because they might end up being prosecuted, jailed themselves, or having their children taken off them, as already noted. Well, I've been doing So there is a significant disconnect between victims' actual experiences of police assistance with community expectations of how police should respond to victims of domestic and family violence. There's been quite a large number of inquiries, royal commissions and studies of police's response to victims of domestic violence within Australia, and they have found that police basically are designed to receive offenders, not victims. They lack empathy towards victims of domestic family violence. They fail to refer victims to support services. They often and frequently engage in victim blaming, trivialising victims' complaints to the point of even siding with the perpetrator, or considering those who complain about domestic violence as a waste of police resources. There was a review undertaken by 23 member countries of the United Nations that concluded that there was in fact very little evidence that the police provide women with protection against domestic and sexual violence. So our study in Argentina then adds to the small but growing body of evidence about the important role of women's police stations, a unique invention from the global south in widening access to justice for the victims of gendered violence. Empirical studies suggest that the women's police stations in Latin America have consistently shown that women are more comfortable reporting to women in a family-friendly environment, and this research also suggests that it enhances women's willingness to report. This then increases the likelihood of some sort of resolution or conviction or prevention. This also enhances women's access to a range of other services such as counselling, health, and social support. So whilst not without their limitations, especially chronic shortages of resources, specialised women forces in the post-colonial societies of the global south certainly widen women's access to justice, and they overcome some of the systemic problems of traditional modes and models of policing gender violence. So I think we have an unusual opportunity arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, which coincided with the killing of George Floyd and then the tumultuous riots over police brutality and the racialised use of the criminal justice system, to really finally move away from carceral feminism, which sought a criminal justice response to domestic family violence and had an adverse impact on men of colour, both in Australia and certainly the United States and elsewhere, and to look for genuine alternatives to criminalisation. Now, Leigh Goodmark has pioneered this research for well over a decade, and this research is looking at restorative and transformative justice interventions to offer a completely different kind of a response to women in situations where they are victims of gender violence. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm assured that Leigh Goodmark, who's also a speaker at this event, will be able to elaborate much more on this particular opportunity. So
thank you, Kerry. And I just would like to raise two issues. This isolation was always the strategy of aggressors. No? They kind of are now in a interesting space for them in order to continue aggressing women. And one of the last issues she mentioned is that we have an unusual opportunity to try to tackle, to achieve some impact and genuine alternative and solutions to address this terrible problem. And with that in mind, we are now going to hear the presentation of Leigh Goodmark. She's going to, her title of her presentation is the U.S. Response to Intimate Partner Violence in the Age of COVID-19. You can ask your questions at the end of the session in the question and answer platform, or raising your hand, or we will open video and audio for you. Leigh, you can continue.
So in the United States, as Kerry said, criminalization has been the primary response to intimate partner violence. And that's been true for years now in the United States, since 1994, with the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in the United States, which is the signature federal legislation on intimate partner violence. We have focused on criminalization to the really to the exclusion of other kinds of remedies. And just to give you a sense of just how strong that focus has been, in 1994, when VAWA was originally enacted, about 62% of its funding went to the criminal legal system. And VAWA is more than anything else a funding bill. It funds police, it funds courts, it funds prosecutors. And so looking at where that funding goes is really a good indication of the US law and policy focus. So 62% of VAWA funding went to the criminal legal system in 1994. By 2013, about 85% of VAWA's funding was going into the criminal legal system. So a very clear indication of where US priorities are in terms of addressing intimate partner violence. The problem, of course, is that in the age of COVID-19, criminalization is not just problematic, as I've argued for quite a long time, as Kerry said, but dangerous, affirmatively dangerous. And so for us, you can't understand COVID-19 without talking about incarceration. As of June 12, 2020, about 44,000 people in US prisons had tested positive for COVID-19, and more than 500 people had died. And infections and deaths related to COVID-19 of incarcerated people are likely underreported. I know that I have clients who have suffered from COVID-19 who are not being counted as COVID-19 sufferers. So we know that those numbers are low. Nonetheless, 8 of the top 10 COVID clusters in the United States are happening in prisons and jails. So asking for the police to intervene when the risk of infection is so high and the consequences are so dire is likely to chill reporting to law enforcement. And reporting to law enforcement is especially problematic given the lack of support for the proposition that criminalization is working. So it would be one thing if criminalization would be said to be deterring intimate partner violence or lowering rates of intimate partner violence in the United States. But as I've argued, and as Kerry said, though neither of those things is true. So let me walk you through that just for a second. So the question is, if criminalization were ending intimate partner violence, then even in the age of COVID, it might make sense, even given all of the risk, to really focus on that as our solution to intimate partner violence. But when you look at rates of criminal of intimate partner violence in the United States, it seems fairly clear that our focus here on criminalization is not, in fact, lowering rates of intimate partner violence. Since 1994 and the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, it is undeniable that rates of intimate partner violence have fallen, and they've fallen significantly. But you have to understand that against the backdrop of the overall rate of violent crime in the United States, which has also fallen significantly since 1994. So from 1994 to about the year 2000, rates of intimate partner violence dropped at about the same pace as the overall crime rate. Rates of intimate partner violence fell 48%, the overall crime rate fell about 47%, so just about the same. From the year 2000 through about 2018, though, rates of intimate partner violence have decreased less than the decrease in the overall crime rate. And so you have to understand that against the backdrop of these hundreds of millions of dollars going into this criminalization response to intimate partner violence, and ask, at a time when we are focusing so many resources in terms of policy attention and in terms of money on intimate partner violence, why aren't we getting even the same drop that the rest of the violent crime rate is getting? And that, to me, suggests that that this focus on criminalization and the money that we're putting into it is not having an appreciable impact. In addition, since 2016, the number of incidents of intimate partner violence in the United States have increased significantly, again, at the same time that we're putting significant resources into intimate partner violence and criminalization. The second question is, does criminalization deter intimate partner violence? And the research from the United States suggests that that's a complicated question. Initially, criminalization was spurred by findings from a study called the Minneapolis Domestic Violence Experiment that suggested that arrest deterred recidivist intimate partner violence. But when that research was replicated, those effects could not be consistently found. In some places, arrest deterred, had a mild deterrent effect on intimate partner violence. In some places, there was no effect at all. And in other places, actually, it spurred intimate partner violence. So there's no consensus in the research that arrest has a positive effect on recidivist intimate partner violence. Similarly, there's no research to suggest that prosecution in and of itself deters intimate partner violence. There is some research to suggest that incarceration, when coupled with significant monitoring post-release, can decrease intimate partner violence. And there's some research to suggest that any kind of significant monitoring post-criminalization, whether it involves incarceration or not, can deter intimate partner violence. So basically, if you are watching someone very closely, they are unlikely to continue to engage in criminal behavior. Now that sidesteps the question of all of the kinds of intimate partner violence that are not criminal and that are deeply problematic. And the research suggests that when those facets of intimate partner violence, when the things that are criminal decrease, other forms of violence increase. So the other piece of this I think that's important is that there's no research to suggest that longer periods of incarceration have any impact on recidivist intimate partner violence. So there's no good basis for arguing that criminalization deters intimate partner violence. At best, the research is equivocal, and it really raises this question of kind of what would deter violence. And my argument has always been that it's change and helping people to change that deters future violence. And there's nothing about criminalization that does that work. So what's happened since March in the United States is that COVID has provided us with an opportunity. At this time, when criminalization can essentially be a death sentence, we need to be asking, as Kerry said, what else can we be doing to address intimate partner violence? What else is going to help? And I would suggest that we could look to 3 distinct areas that might make a significant difference in the perpetration of intimate partner violence and that are going to be particularly acute post-COVID: economics, public health, and community-based responses. So starting with economics, intimate partner violence, as you know, is highly correlated in the United States, at least, with poverty and with other indicators of material deprivation. It is more frequent and more severe for low-income women. And the single most important factor here, I think, it has to do with, and I need to just stop to say, I am talking largely about violence by men against women, because that's the vast majority of the violence in the United States, which is not to suggest that violence does not happen in same-sex relationships or to gender nonconforming or non-binary people. So forgive me for the generalization. But that, again, also that's where most of the research is. And so that's part of why I focus in that way. And one of the things that our research shows us is that men who are under and unemployed are more likely to use violence. So it was interesting to me to hear Kerry say that men are calling into intervention programs to say, I need help. Not at all surprising given the job loss that is associated with COVID-19. The more under and unemployed men that we have, the greater rates of intimate partner violence are likely to be. Men's poor work history predicts risk for intimate partner violence. And for us, male unemployment, as I've said, has been the single most important demographic risk factor for intimate partner violence. COVID has created significant unemployment in the United States. There are about 30 million people in the United States seeking unemployment assistance. Money that is going into criminalization could be much better used to ease economic stress. And so what could that look like? That could look like job training. That could look like employment services. It could look like an increase in the minimum wage. A 2016 report by the White House Council of Economic Advisors found that raising the minimum wage in the United States to $12 an hour could reduce criminal activity by 3 to 5%. So guaranteeing some kind of income, whether that's through a higher minimum wage or even through a guaranteed family income or guaranteed minimum income in the United States, could have a significant impact on intimate partner violence. The second thing I think that we have a real opportunity to do is to invest in prevention. And there are a number of domains upon which we could kind of have this conversation. First, we could talk about preventing adverse childhood experiences. So the ACEs studies, or adverse childhood experience studies out of the United States, show that a child's own victimization or exposure to a mother's abuse create twice the risk of perpetration or victimization, and those risks are cumulative. The greater the number of adverse experiences that a child has in their life, the greater the likelihood that they will perpetrate intimate partner violence or be a victim of intimate partner violence. And so how do we address those adverse childhood experiences? By intervening early and actively in the lives of kids who are likely to be abused and neglected through parenting programs, through nurse-family partnership programs during pregnancy, through home visitation programs, or through fatherhood programs that specifically target fathers who are using violence. And there are prototypes for programs like that in the United States. For example, the Fathers for Change program, which looks at the intersection of substance abuse and intimate partner violence. Thinking about how to improve the lives of children is will pay dividends down the road in terms of deterring further violence. The second thing that we can think about is interventions with adolescents. There's a good body of research now that suggests that programs that reach adolescents either through school or through other community-based settings can have a significant positive impact on their later likelihood of perpetrating intimate partner violence. In the United States, we have a number of those programs, including a program called Coaching Boys into Men, which uses sports coaches to reach boys at the adolescent age to talk to them about masculinity, to talk to them about relationships and what healthy relationships look like. We also have a significant body of research out of both the United States and Canada on intervention, school-based intervention programs like the Shifting Boundaries program, the Safe Dates program, and the 4th R program. And all of those are evidence-backed programs that suggest that intervening with kids as adolescents can pay off dividends in the long term. We also have to work with men. And I think one thing as a movement that we've been particularly bad about is working with men. Traditionally, or going back 25 years when I started working in the movement, we very much thought that men who used violence were not able to be changed. They were monsters and they needed to go to jail. I would have said the same thing 25 years ago when I started doing this work. I think what some of us have come to realize is that most people who are using violence have also experienced some kind of trauma in their own past. And if we don't address the trauma that these people have experienced, they will continue to use violence. That acting out for control is not just about patriarchy. It's not just about the ways that we understand manhood. It's also about people's need for control in their own lives that comes from a history of victimization or a history of trauma. So the best intervention programs in the United States are able to hold these two complicated ideas in their hands at the same time, that people can have been traumatized and that people can use violence. And we can understand that someone has been traumatized and not use that as an excuse for their behavior, but as an explanation that helps us to understand how we might intervene in a positive way. The Strength at Home Men's program in the United States is doing that work with combat veterans who are returning from overseas postings, oftentimes with post-traumatic stress disorder, and then using violence in their relationships. PTSD is highly correlated with intimate partner violence, so addressing that PTSD that people have experienced is an important part of getting at why they're using violence, and we can be doing that work. The last thing I would say in the realm of prevention has to do with population level interventions, one of which people are more willing to hear and one of which they're less willing to hear. The thing that people are more willing to hear is that we need gun control, and many places don't have this problem that the United States has with the wide dissemination of guns, but for us, guns are involved in about half of intimate partner violence homicides. You are 5 times more likely to be killed if your partner has a gun. In the United States, we can't do meaningful work on intimate partner violence if we don't do something around gun control. The more global problem is around alcohol, and this is the one that people don't like to talk about, again, because it feels like an excuse rather than an explanation. But what the research tells us is that people are 11 times more likely to use violence when they are drinking, and that injuries are more likely to be severe when people are drinking. We know from, if you go on your social media websites, you know that people are drinking more as a response to this virus, and that alcohol use has increased significantly, both kind of in a fun, mom is having a glass of wine kind of way, but also in much more problematic kinds of ways. So I would not be surprised if that increase in alcohol use during COVID-19 is translating to greater violence and more severe violence. We can intervene not just individually, but with population level interventions that make alcohol more expensive or more difficult to obtain, or decrease our societal focus on alcohol through communications campaigns and other kinds of things. So those are the population level interventions I think we need to be thinking about. In terms of community level factors, community factors are associated with higher rates of intimate partner violence. So living in a neighborhood with high unemployment, low average male literacy rates, and concentrated poverty makes you more likely to be experiencing intimate partner violence. Partly that has to do with the lack of social cohesion within communities and with the perceptions of high levels of neighborhood disorder. So I think the richest work that's going on in the United States right now has to do with these kinds of community level interventions. There's a lot of conversation in the United States right now about pod mapping and mutual aid. Pod mapping was originally developed as a tool for confronting harm like intimate partner violence and ensuring that accountability would happen for that harm. But it's being used during the crisis in a bit of a different way. What pod mapping does is asks, who can you turn to for support? Who are the people that you can immediately ask for support, and what specific concrete things can you ask of them? So if you have a close friend down the hall, can you safety plan with that friend? If you're in an apartment building and that friend hears something happening in your house, can you plan with them about what they might do to be helpful, who they might call? Someone other than the police, if that's what you prefer. What specific supports can you offer to other people who are experiencing intimate partner violence? Can you offer a place to stay? Will you be the person who they can quarantine with? Can you put resources into that family so that if economic stress is part of what's driving violence, can you help in that way? So pod mapping is, I think, similar to the safety planning that we've always done with victims of intimate partner violence, but in a broader way because it considers others in the community who can be helpful. I think that's one of the things that we can think about as this crisis goes on. Community accountability is also an important strategy for thinking about how to hold people accountable outside of the context of the criminal legal system. community accountability means empowering communities to respond to violence without calling the police. We have organizations in the United States doing that work. Creative Interventions, which was in the San Francisco Bay Area, created a 600-page toolkit on community accountability that is available online, if that is something that you are interested in, that gets at this question of what do communities need to be able to intervene positively, and how do we get them to a place where they can do that, so that anyone who walks through the door and says, I need help, this specific thing is what I need, the community is in a place where they can respond to that need and think about how to fulfill it. Other kinds of work that's being done in the United States, the Northwest Network has a program called Far Out, which provides guidance for family and friends on how to respond to intimate partner violence. And that's very much responsive to the data that we have that shows that most people don't first go to formal systems. They go to friends, they go to family, and they go to community members. So we need to be able to equip people to do that. Another crucial question, I think, is who should our first responders be? If we don't want police intervening, particularly in this time when incarceration, at least in the United States, is so dangerous, then who should our first responder to violence be? And in some places in the United States, we have what are called violence interruption programs, where people with training in violence and training in de-escalation of violence specifically, who come from the communities where they're serving, are actually the first responders to violent incidents. And they are better able to reason with the people who are there because they don't have that adversarial relationship. And the chances of escalation are lesser because they don't have weapons. And they're doing a lot of positive work in decreasing rates of violence in communities. So we could think about a world in which the first responder to a violent situation is not somebody with the capacity to make it worse. It's somebody with de-escalation training whose goal is to bring the entire situation down, as opposed to putting another person into the system.
We have 1 minute, please.
Okay, and so Kerry talked a little bit about restorative justice, and I can talk more about that if people have questions about it. There's a tremendous body of literature about that. In terms of global solutions, we are in an emergency right now, but there are bigger questions that we need to confront, and I think COVID could prompt us to do that. First is understanding the origins of violence. We've done very poor work around really understanding why people use violence. We need to be committed to that. Second, we are in the middle of a defund the police moment, so we need to ask ourselves, what work is the carceral system doing for us? Are there better ways to do this? What do we actually hope to get from police? And how do we better ensure accountability? And finally, at least in the United States, we need to be thinking about building a broader movement, that the movement against intimate partner violence has to be an anti-poverty movement. It has to be an anti-racism movement. It has to be a movement that ensures mental health services for those who need them, substance abuse services for those who need them. There's a great amount of rebuilding that needs to be done in the United States. The intimate partner violence movement should be part of that movement. All of this is covered in my book, which is called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence. If you want more of that, that is where I would point you. And I want to thank you so much for including me in this symposium.
Thank you, Leigh, for such an interesting presentation. I think you will have a mass of people buying your book right now. Now I'm going to give the word to Lars Alberth, who is going to speak on the blind spot of violence against women in times of COVID.
Children, women.
Children. Sorry.
Try to be quick, or let's see about that. So, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit of why children are a blind spot in dealing with violence under these times of Corona and in sociology in general. And I'm going to walk through a little steps there. So I'm first going to talk about how sociology usually conceives about that. And the overall approach that sociology developed was that modernity is peaceful. And it used by having that kind of idea about the modernity as a peaceful society, it shut out both women and children and the situation of women and children, and the family was conceived only as a space of socialization, and that is preparation for public life. And this notion was, I think, challenged by three different approaches, but these approaches were kind of problematic in their own way because they never really took violence against children really into account as a severe problem where children are not just, dependents of somebody, but as individuals with their own rights. So one is the Sociology of Social Problems, which kind of addressed violence against children as a professional enterprise, which was for sure helpful in analyzing how social problems came about and who has an interest in that, but they also ignored the extent and severity of violence against children. Then we have a more recent approach, which they call themselves the New Sociology of Violence, which stems mostly from an international perspective, which stems from the recognition of violence in war-ridden societies and marginalized groups, stating that there are situations, there are societies in modernity that are not peaceful, and there are groups, especially in the global south, from an intersectional perspective, there are people who suffer violence, but interestingly enough, children did not really enter their sphere of considerations and research. So that is probably a part of the problem, as these research is so tied to the social movements that other groups are more in the focus here. And then there is, of course, the victimization research, which actually provides evidence that children are victimized and are amongst the most victimized groups in the societies. But their problem, from my view, is that they actually only, make it a topic because of the consequences for adult societies, and from a rather functionalist rationale. It is about the prevention of further deviance, and it actually does not look at the children as individual holders of rights. So the problem is that, as Leigh just told you and made an argument about that, and that's their general argument, victimization leads to more deviance, and we have to counter that. But the question of violence against children is not really, it's not the problem for them in general, but the consequences for them as future executors of violence. So, and I'm looking at that from a perspective of the sociology of childhood, which has the notion of a generational order very closely tied to or developed in analogy to the gender order. So we have different age groups that have different rights, obligations, different statuses, and violence is an elemental building block of that order. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we actually know about victimizations of children and their situations in general in Germany, and we don't have a lot of statistics. We don't have a lot of epidemiological data on them. We have the official statistics. There you see we have, last year we had 2018, we had 160,000 approximately reports to child protections, and from that, about 50,000 cases were substantiated as some kind of endangerment of the child. That's the legal term that we use in Germany for any kind of abuse or neglect. We don't have data way back, so we only started it in 2012 for these kind of decision-making in child protection. There's no real guideline for practical and reflexive knowledge in child protection, how they should apply that. We don't have any information on the distribution and trajectory of cases. We don't have any data on recidivism. We don't know how many kids are actually reported during that year, like if kids are reported several times. And of course, we don't know why we have more reports. As with any public statistics, the causes for the changes remain undeterminable. You see that when you take a look at the cases where children were taken into custody, that only about 8% or 16% of these cases were due to abuse or neglect. And instead, in a lot of other cases, the decision was made because of other causes, like the parents being overburdened, they had relationships problems, they had other reasons, or due to the migration of people to Germany. Unaccompanied migrants are also taken into custody. They fall also in this category. They make up to 16% also. Then there are basically two epidemiological research projects in the last couple of years. One is more criminological, one is more medical, and psychiatric. And you see here, I didn't really have time to translate in English, sorry. But what you see is the red numbers here are severe, like people who experience severe violence by their parents. And we have it about the people who are 16 to 20 years old experienced about 7.5% experience that, and a third during their growing up experienced some kind of not so severe violence. So that's mostly corporal punishment here, and then abuse probably. And you see also that these are the numbers for sexual abuse. Women have about 7% of the women experience some kind of sexual abuse with body contact, and 9.9% any form of sexual abuse. And with men, it's a little bit down. I'm not going to talk about the risk factors here, so only that you have a first impression. A second psychiatric medical approach, that's the only kind of study that looks for polyvictimization of children. And this was from 2017. So the data is about 5 years old now. There's a group of the 14 to 19 years old, they're 13.5% answered that they experienced some kind of maltreatment or neglect, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, or physical neglect. So it's about 13.4% overall in the age group of 14 to 19 who reported that. And that is 50,000 per year, enter or are substantiated by the child protection system, and 14% of about 14 million of children under 18 experience some kind of abuse here. So there's a huge gap between recognizing it by child protection services and the experiences of the kids. And this is, so my argument here is basically that there are several barriers for recognizing this. And child protection services in Germany actually, and they are traditionally family-oriented, visiting help, supporting parents. They do not really consider their cases as cases of violence. And you see that here. We did a couple of years back research on how they frame their cases, how they tell their cases. We had social workers, pediatricians, and midwives who are all some kind of involved in child protection or prevention programs. And they told us their cases, and we had 58 cases from social workers. And you see that only 6 cases were kind of driven by some incidents of violence. And comparatively, no case was instigated by a lack of care or a lack of education. That was not the problem. The problem that child protection services, and we have to discuss about that in a minute, how they conceive of it is mostly a problem of the client's compliance with the child protection services. How do the mothers especially respond to the expectations of the social workers? Are they there when they do a home visitation? Do they lie? Do they tell the truth? These are kind of the issues that govern the narrations of the social workers. Or on the other hand, their kind of lifestyle, their life management, the ways that they lead their life. They have too many partners, the social worker said. They have too many kids from too many partners. They have drug abuse. They so that's the majority of their cases, that how they conceive it. So violence does not really enter the manifest description of cases here. And that's a typical approach in the German Child Protection Service. So they work with the mothers mostly. They almost never work with the fathers or the male partners of the mothers. The mothers are usually perceived as overburdened. They invoke a narrative or evoke a language of a limited agency, of a lack of capacities for organizing their own life. They mostly never work with the fathers. And what they do is they actually address the mothers not as mothers. They more or less treat the mothers as housewives. So they work with them on how to do the household, how to cook properly, how to manage their appointments, how to organize their everyday life. But education does not really enter, neither education nor care nor aggressive behavior towards the kids actually enters the main program here. And that's a little bit of a problem when it comes to preventing violence, because you do not treat mothers or as carers or as probable perpetrators, but you treat them as housewives, basically. That's the main program. And so you see that, I'm going to skip that. So children are more or less left out. They are not really considered by child protection in general. They may be the cause of intervention, but they're not the address, they are not the clients. Interventions are not really geared towards the kids in most cases. And so we have a little data coming up that shows how child protection even doesn't believe the kids when they tell them that they were victims of abuse or neglect. So the current conditions, we do not actually know much about what's actually happening to children right now. So what happened when the lockdown came or the shutdown came? Children, school closed, kindergartens closed. Children were basically separated from any public life and secluded into the privacy of the family. And that means not only a limited access to their public visibility, and not only limited access to schooling, but also to social resources, to friends, neighbors, teachers, and to safe spaces beyond the family. That's schools, kindergarten, friends, other families, and so on. Then one of the studies by Sabine Andresen and others, they recently interviewed parents on their experiences, and we see that the pandemic hit selectively, that you find two modes of experience. One is that parents are quite happy that they don't have to be engaged in the organization of the child's life, their hobbies, their schools, so they have time with the kids and they enjoy it. That's true for part of the families, but for other families, they are more or less under more stress. And so someone says, for my child, everything is okay, but I have bad conscience towards her, the daughter, because I don't have that much time for myself and time for rest, and I'm reacting annoyed more often, but I talk to her and try to explain it. So parents are aware that the situation for the kids might not be that good, actually. But these are two modes of experiences that are observable, and they go along with social inequality for sure. We have a couple of media reports on increases of severe cases and barriers to support and child protection services. So we had a couple of reports that showed that child protection services receive 15% less cases. That it was from mid-March to mid-April, 7,000 cases versus 8,300 cases. So people do not report that often to the services, which might in the end not be that severe, but it is a problem here. And we had also reports from mid-May that were medical staffs from who reported or had cases of injured children who called to child protection hotlines to get counsel on these cases, and they reported way more severe cases where they said it's like almost like accidents with cars, it's broken bones, abusive head trauma, etc. And this was in mid-May, and they had like 50 calls in the first half of May compared to 50 calls in all of April. So there seems to be an increase in severe cases. Oops. How much time do I have?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Oh my God. So there's one study who actually shows that who asked 3,880 women on their experiences of violence in the last month, and they also asked for the kids. And in these cases, 6.5% of the household reported that children were physically punished. So that's on the average. So there's no really increase, but it increased severely if the household was quarantined, if the household faced economic insecurities, the economic status of one of the partners got worse, or if one of the partners had some mental health problem, and households with kids that were under 10 years old also had an increase of cases. So I think that goes along with what my co-speakers told you. So then I thought about how it actually, how kids are actually presented in the public discourse. And I think there are four discourses currently, and they fall along the lines of children being either threatened or being a threat themselves. And being threatened is not about violence in most of these cases, but it's about the human capital of the kids and how they would not achieve their graduations in the senior classes of schools. That is one of the ways that threatened children are presented. And then there is a couple of severe cases of sexual abuse that rose up in the last weeks, which are discussed lively, but there are the exceptional cases. And there were 2 cases of sexual abuse where one, especially in the last week, where 3 boys were sexually abused by 11 men and filmed, and it was all over the news. And then there is one case where a kindergarten teacher killed a 3-year-old girl, and who was not suitable for the job, as they found out later on. So that's mostly how violence against children is portrayed, but not on the overall level. So to conclude, children's rights to provision, protection, and participations are not really considered, neither in political decision-making and public life under COVID-19. We have a physical seclusion of the kids, and that leads to an increase, and also an increase in severity of cases. The incidence of violence remains relatively constant, except for those cases where the effects of Corona hit. And there we have higher rates, and then we have also less infrastructure and less support. And it's mostly the closing of the schools and kindergartens that I'm really concerned about here. And the public discourse on children operates, I say, as usual. The children are either portrayed as threatening. That's what I didn't talk about. So they are often perceived as virus slingers. So they might be the ones that keep Corona around, or threatened exclusive sex abuse scandals, or these very severe sex abuse scandals, or a loss of human capital. So COVID-19 exposes generational inequalities that were there all along, but the lockdown of public life tightened, I guess, the already marginal resources for children. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars, very, very much. It's a very interesting presentation, and it gets in my mind this idea of how social workers or in general people who work with victims frame their cases in order maybe to to match their bias, their original bias. Well, now we're going to open to question and answers. We have one question from Sumath Hiremith, and then we go with Wendy Bond. We're going to open the microphone for you, and we have just like 5 or 7 minutes, so we ask for brief your questions. Sumath, I can hear you now.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible? Hello.
We hear you.
Yeah, it was a very nice presentation. Hope I am audible. There's some internet connection problem. I would like to know that the children who hello.
Yes, we hear you perfectly. Oh, I think we lost him. Yes, maybe we can go to the second with Wendy de Bond. You would like also to ask a question, and maybe after that we can recopy your summons.
Okay, thank you. My name is Wendy. I'm a professor of criminal law here in Belgium. And I just had a quick question. I already had a little bit of a discussion with Leigh on it. I had a question on the extent to which gender perspectives are included in your research. I think, Lars, that could also be interesting for you. The reason why I ask is that in Belgium, we currently have a discussion ongoing regarding the extent to which gender should be a relevant element in criminalization and criminal procedures. So whether the gender of the victim should have any bearing on the perceived severity of the behavior. And the reason why we have this discussion is that, for example, when it comes to hate crime or hate violence, we say that an act against a person of a certain minority should be perceived worse because you're not only victimizing that particular person, but also the group behind the minority. And so we're also having that discussion with respect to gender. And I was just wondering whether in your research, because everything is being rediscussed now with COVID, whether in your research, in your experience, you've come across the relevance of gender when it comes to criminalization. It's a very open question, but I just wanted to use the opportunity to use you as a sparring partner.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. We have Sumanth back. Maybe we can hear your question now. Sumanth? Hello? Okay, maybe Leigh, you can start your answer.
Hello.
Oh, we have now Sumanth.
Yeah. How about the people? It's in the presentation I heard that only the women are being in the domestic the end of the domestic violence. It's similarly there are men as well who are being sufferers in the domestic violence. They are being abused physically as well as sexually in this COVID-19. So and as well as the elderly through by their sister, by daughter-in-laws or the son-in-laws. So I would like to know how can we tackle ourselves from this domestic violence, which is from our own family members. This is one. And how where can we get the emotional assistance or emotional self-care in this pandemic situation? In the outside there is a coronavirus, and inside there are coronavirus family members who are torturing. So how can we tackle this condition? This is in a general to the world, and as well as in India especially. I'm doing a research on that, and it's in the process. So this is my question to the panelist. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sumant. Leigh, you have an amazing time of 1 minute to answer that question. I'm sorry, the other session has to start, and maybe Lars want to add a word on that.
So very quickly, in terms of Wendy's question, there are conversations going on about gender in criminal law, particularly around intimate partner violence, but a lot of what they're around is the criminalization of survivors. So there are large numbers of survivors of intimate partner violence who have been criminalized for things related to their own survival. And that's an ongoing conversation in the US. Other than that, not in the way that I think that Wendy is contemplating. As to the second question, I did acknowledge there are absolutely male victims of violence. They are entitled to our respect. They need our help. They need services. I think one thing that people can do right now is try to reach out to community-based organizations, friends, religious organizations, others, if it is not safe to reach out to formal systems. And I think that's a lot of what's happening around us to get that emotional self-care, to get that emotional support.
What Wendy said, sorry, what Leigh said. it's basically, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Leigh, Lars, and Kerry at the long distance. Thank you for this panel, and thank you for all people attending. We are now going to have a mini break, and after that we are going to continue with the third session of this webinar.